We start on planet Krypton just a few minutes before it's due to explode. Oh no, apparently this is the immediate aftermath of a destructive and fiery ejaculation. And because she has plot armor up the kazoo, Gladys somehow seems to have survived the giant fuck-off volcanic eruption at the end of the last epi with apparently no breathing problems at all. And while she can clearly hear strained cries of babies all around her, she prefers to just stand around looking gormless before a flaming horse of the apocalypse charges at her in a painfully cringy and on-the-nose metaphor. So after ignoring the desperate pleas of the common plebs begging for help, she suddenly hears the warbled tones of the kid from Leeds, and only then decides he's worth helping because he's a member of the main cast. And then randomly wanders off with this kid who she barely knows, instead of helping the villagers no longer be on fire. Conversely, Queen Muriel does seem to give a shit about people horrifically burning to death in fires and being crushed under giant beams, and helps Isildur save his buddy Valendil, aka Raj from the Big Bang Theory, from being crushed to death. But alas, arrives too late to rescue Ontimo, who now lies flat and with deader eyes than Queen Alicent getting porked by a scabby king. Still breathing perfectly fine despite the air being filled with burning ash, Isildur rescues some people from a burning house, until it totally collapses on top of him and it looks like it's curtains for the #1 Aladdin cosplayer in the whole of Middle-earth. Then we cut to the Jolly Hardfoots in one of the most tonally jarring shifts since Superman snapped Zod's neck and then producers threw up the crest of hope to inspiring music barely 2 minutes later at the end of Man of Steel. Fuck you! And before you can say, why don't Harfoots just design some Nike foot coverings when they're constantly wading through mud and swamps, they come across a field with a bunch of scorched shrubs. All the fruit is ruined, so naturally the giant magic bloke rubs himself against a tree until it collapses on Nori and a random kid. And before you can say, that's what you get for molesting trees, we cut to the dwarf kingdom of Khazad Dûm, where the elves are trying to negotiate access to their super secret mithril mines, in exchange for game, grain and timber for the next 500 years. King Durin asks why they should trust any elf, and Elrond hilariously says he shouldn't trust any old elf, but can totally trust him. You know, the guy what made a sacred oath only 2 weeks ago and immediately broke it barely 7 days later when he told his king all about the precious new ore they found after he said that they were totally going to go extinct without it because reasons. Anyway, the king reckons their time has come, and so won't be giving them their newfound precious muck what they scraped out of the ground. But the first female dwarf without a beard wants to seditiously ignore her father-in-law and her very own king, and says one day it'll all be theirs anyway, so why don't we just sod it and go mine the stuff now? And because he's so honourable, the elfy flat-faced fella just barges in without knocking before he's told that Daddy Durin said he can't have any muck, so now he can sod off. Captain Flatface concedes, and says he has to go now to tell his own king that they're all totally up Shit's Creek. Durin sits down to have a little cry, before noticing a poisoned leaf totally get better after being in the proximity of the mithril somehow. Back in Mordor, the scorched up Southlands, the blonde female elf with perpetual PMT has to restrain Theo from charging out like a right bad lad at the remaining orcs, because they haven't got reinforcements, ammunition or even a basic face covering to protect their lungs from the molten ash that don't seem to be affecting their breathing anyway. I swear I haven't heard one fucker cough yet. Elsewhere, Raj tells Elendil that his Aladdin son is presumed dead, and was likely crushed harder than Kevin Hart when Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson rolls over in the middle of the night. And not even the ghost of Robin Williams can bring this fella back from being squished flatter than Prince Elrond's face. Meanwhile, Theo seeks a bit of reassurance that all his friends and family aren't total goners and now he's left alone in the world. But Gladys is a strong female character, and so offers the square sum of 0 maternal or empathetic words of comfort at all, and just says try not to think about it, mate. Although she does give him a weapon, so now he upgrades from a broken sword handle to a full sword handle, only now with a blade attached. Cool, talk about character progression. Back in the forests, the Queen hilariously asks how much further till we're out of this smoke. You know, all that ash that's in the air after that volcano totally erupted yet seems to have made no impact on anyone's lung capacity or ability to speak at all. Well, it turns out she hasn't noticed any change either because she's as blind as a bat, but she doesn't want anyone else to know. So, because he almost squashed 2 little girls with a giant fuck-off tree, Sir Lenny of the Henrys tells the massive magic bloke to sling his hook, but not before giving him the most basic map of the stars since my granddad got me my first big book of space for Christmas '95. Nori gives him an apple to see him on his way, before moaning to her mum like a right millennial whinger that she's just a half-foot and that's all she'll ever be. And so what, love? What's wrong with being a tiny woman with big feet and a bird's nest in your hair? It certainly worked for Barbara Streisand. Anyway, before they turn in for the night under a random log, Gladys reveals that she had a husband called Celeborn, who is now dead, and that's why she has a resting bitch face, what also makes her look chronically constipated all the time. She also says they met dancing in a field, where she called him a silver clown because his armour didn't fit. Or something like that. Man, why can't I ever meet ladies that way? Last time I tried wooing some skirt by dancing in a field, I got sectioned under the Mental Health Act and told to take that tutu off and take a bunch of meds. Anyway, L. Ron Hubbard and that Scottish dwarf are mining for the stash of mithril behind the king's back, but pause to give the rocks time to resettle, which handily gives them a moment to have some character development. Which mainly consists of Elrond mocking his buddy's name being the same as his dad and granddad, before Durin reveals that they actually have secret names which they only use with family, such as wives, parents, or brothers. And he's totally about to entrust him with his very special name, but Elrond says, "Shut up, you tart, because we got work to do, son." But suddenly, Durin's dad Durin catches the pair red-handed, and before long the creator of Scientology is chucked out of the realm like a mangy cat who gave them all fleas. The king and prince of little people have a barney about the king suffocating any ambition in his son, whilst King Durin says his boy's a straight up traitor for saying his flat-faced chum is like a brother to him, and so the king rips off his fancy crest implying he's no longer worthy of it. But rather than leave that to the subtext, the king then proceeds to turn around and specifically tell him that he's not worthy of it and is totally not his anymore. Whoa, such great writing! Elsewhere, Budget Elijah Wood with a bird's nest in her hair awakes to her friend Poppy scoffing a giant apple, which they were supposed to be saving for winter and shit. But Poppy says, "Relax bro," and she looks outside to see the trees have now made more apple products than a sweatshop in China. Their joy is short-lived, however, as that evening they find that trio of white supremacist witches from episode 5, before trying to stand up to their superiors who proceed to set their whole life on fire. Which on paper might sound like a critique of corporate capitalism in some way, but actually just comes off as a really silly thing for the Harfoots to even attempt to do. Back with the Southland refugees, Theo tries to find his missing mother, and after a second Bronwyn death fake out in 2 episodes in a row, Theo reunites with his mum, who somehow survived an arrow to the chest and a giant fuck-off volcanic eruption all within the same 24-hour period. Seriously, she doesn't even wince or anything. Oh, and of course, the first black elf with one facial expression is also unharmed, as his Botox brow was far too thick for any of the molten lava to penetrate. Gladys then asks where that Muriel bird is at, and turns out the Queen's up doing some ninja shit on the mountain. Oh wait, no, she's just blind. Galadriel bows before the Queen and says she's sorry that she dragged them all this way just to die and go blind. The Queen, however, remains defiant. Elendil, though, just wants to go home, having lost his son, and because he realises what an epic clusterfuck of a disaster this whole trip has been. Seriously, they took 3 episodes to convince Muriel to gather up her forces, sail over to Middle-earth and aid their people, and all they did was save a dozen villagers, blind the Queen, and then turn around and go back home after 36 hours. Huh, no wonder he stands on top of a mountain and has a little cry into camera. Aww. In the aftermath of the conflagration, most of the fake hobbits are in total despair, before Daddy Harfoot tells them all to cheer up and stop being Debbie Downers all the time. Bruh. And remember that they have no practical skills at all except for their collective keen spirits and can-do attitudes. And before you can say, "Hang on a minute, wasn't this the guy who just got left behind by the tribe over a dodgy ankle and only survived because his daughter befriended a giant magic man who pulled a cart through?" Nori and Poppy say they're going to go back up to the giant wizard bloke, who they reckon is apparently in sore need of assistance from 2 little girls with hairy feet. So Lenny of the Henrys is also told to go with them by his own wife like a riot cack. And they all set off to find a giant magical alien being pursued by 3 other giant magical aliens to God knows where. Gladys then goes to see an injured Halbrand who she forgot all about. And although he seems to have a giant septic wound and despite being half dead, she says she's totally going to take him on a 3-month journey to Lindon to get some elvish medicine. But he says he ain't going to go and abandon his new subjects barely 48 hours after being recognised as king, and so he is somehow now well enough to climb up onto a horse, as they all cheer for this guy who they never met 2 days ago, and despite almost all of their loved ones having totally perished ever since he turned up. But they ride off up a giant hill regardless. Meanwhile, Prince Durin goes all emo and reckons he's failed at life, but the first female dwarf without a beard once again tells him that one day this will all be theirs, and probably any day now. Because his dad's an aging paranoid crack and will be gone soon anyway, so he should probably cheer up. The Dwarf King then stubbornly orders the bountiful mine of Mithril to be sealed up, before randomly throwing a leaf down into it which wakes up a giant fuck-off fire demon. And it turns out this Balrog thing fucking hates litterers and is totally not going to let that bearded midget get away with swording his cosy comfy cavey home. And we end with the orcs hailing the Adar fella as the Lord of the Southlands. But Adar reckons that name is outdated now everything in that place is burned to the ground. So Waldreg asks what they should call it, and after walking away before his master can even answer the question, a title card literally spells it out, changing from the word Southlands to Mordor. Even though we all practically got that reference given the giant volcanic Mount Doom smouldering in the background, and it's all just so on the nose that he may as well have just given a cheesy wink to camera. Anyway, that's it. That's episode 7. Man, that was a confusing and depressing epi. Though watching Galadriel cosplay as a dwarf by standing next to Hallbrand, even though she's supposed to be 6'4" in the lore, defo cheered me up. Bruh. Now on to the season finale. We start with celebrations in my pants that this shit is finally about to be over for a few years, whilst that giant magic bloke spots some rando who totally has eyes for his apple. It appears to be Nori, but then she does a Las Vegas quick change from a fake hobbit to that Ku Klux Klan member from episode 5. Then 2 more show up and they totally reckon he's that Sauron bloke what tramp stamped Galadriel's brother to death a few years ago. And did a load more bad things too. Anyway, after another 1 minute and 40-second opening title sequence, Prince Elrond tells this Celery Brimbor fella that they have no choice but to give up and go tell their king that they totally failed at making a means of saving all of Elfindom, even with the new muck what the dwarves scraped out the ground, and now they're truly doomed to fade away like ashes. Or Sam Worthington. Suddenly, though, Galadriel arrives, or Gladders to you, and tells the lads that she totally rode back from the Southlands with a dying Halbrand flopping about behind her for a full 6 days without rest. And blimey, if that's true, her poor horse must be well fucked, and more tired than a Reddit mod banning anyone with a sensible opinion. Later, the medics are patching up Halbrand, whilst Elrond apologises for encouraging her to get on that ship to go home, and that he should have trusted her when she said her task was not yet complete until she takes out that Sauron geezer what no one still has any evidence of being alive. So he promises her to trust her judgment in future and totally not think for himself ever again. Or something like that. Also later, a suspiciously swiftly healed Halbrand can barely hide his raging lob on at coming face to face with the legendary Celery Brimbor, as he used to work as an apprentice blacksmith and his master never shut up about the wonders of his craft. Then he spots a trio of jewels alongside a peculiar ore, though Sellers says it doesn't work, because the more you use it, the more it dilutes its power, or some shit. Halbrand then tells him how to do his job, despite literally just saying he was an unsurpassed master of his craft, and advises him to use a simple alloy to amplify the qualities of the new ore. And Celery Brimbor totally cringes at being made to look a right mug in his own field of work by a half-dead bloke who can't afford a haircut. Elsewhere, Pharazôn eulogises the old Númenorian king before he's even dead because reasons, and says, soon he will travel that road which makes an end of every man what walks it. And all I can think is, why bloody walk it then? Seriously, just take the bus around the back street, son. Anyway, shortly after, Emma Watson with that forehead what still haunts me after I close my eyes at night, startles the dying king, who awakes and says to her that he knows what she's been doing in the dark of night when she thought his eyes were closed. He also says he knows what she did last summer, although she wasn't even in that movie, and as far as I can tell from my rather extensive research, she was busy last summer getting her tits out on a beach in frustratingly low resolution. Anyway, he shows her the Seeing Stone of Palantir. You know, that blue ball what gets bluer and bluer whenever any frigid bird sticks their hand on it. And to be honest, I'm still caught up on both how this show and House of the Dragon put out episodes in the very same week what features a dying king who thinks a stuck-up middle-class white girl is his daughter and heir, while spitting incoherent nonsense about apocalyptic prophecies. Oh, what a coinkydink! Anyway, we then cut back to the elves who are telling the king that the answer to all their problems lies in them making a rounded holder for the jewels. A crown, perhaps, or something circular at least. And before that kinky Elrond fella can suggest perhaps maybe a cock ring, King Gil-galad declares that time runs short, even shorter than Gladders, who's supposed to be 6'4" but is shorter here than all of them because blatant disrespect of law. Celery Brimbor of the Rings then goes all Hellraiser, and says that they're so close to constructing something that will give them power. Not just of the flesh, but over flesh. Gil-galad reckons he's gone too far in quoting them Cenobite nutters, and demands he packs in what he's doing and sod off back to Lindon. Luckily, the elfy flat-faced fella what fell face first into a George Foreman grilling machine when he was young, totally manages to convince the king to give them 3 more months to save their asses from extinction by hilariously repeating back his own words to him from earlier epis. For some bizarre reason, Budget Kate Blanchett with perpetual PMT is totally suspicious of Halbrand now, and orders the campest elf in Elfland to go look him up on www.seemyfamilytree.com. Though he says it will take a little time, and also a £10 searches fee. Speak of the devil, said Halbrand fella can't believe his lucky stars that a humble blacksmith from a random raft in the sea like him has somehow ended up right in the middle of the elves' base at Eregion. He thanks her for helping him and for pushing him to reach heights that no one else could have, something that he'll never forget, and ominously says he'll ensure no one else will either. Galadriel's spidey sense then kicks into overdrive when the musical score notifies her that he might be a bit of a wrong'un. Back in the Greenwood Forest, the three racialists in white hoods tell the giant magic bloke, aka Sauron, that whoever cast him out placed a veil on his mind to make him forget stuff and struggle to communicate properly. Which makes me worry that the current POTUS may also be a Sauron-type fella and all.
True international effort to pressure.
They say his name again, and then it gets bare windy. We're talking windier than Brian Stelter on Taco Bell night. Anyway, she then breathes some COVID into his face and knocks him out for 2 weeks to slow the spread both of his uncontrollable magics and also Alzheimer's. Suddenly, Sir Lenny of the Henrys reveals himself hiding under some leaves, whilst those other fake hobbits pop up too, including that budget Elijah Wood with a bird's nest in her hair, who totally can't believe that she's now seen the Dark Lord's Willy back in episode 1. Whoa, imagine if that was the case in Harry Potter. I mean, it would certainly explain why that Specky kid was so scarred and traumatised for years. Anyway, Nori tries to release the sleeping tied-up magic giant who was just revealed to be an infamously powerful and evil Dark Lord because 8 episodes worth of an emotional connection, bro. But suddenly he wakes up. So naturally, Lenny Henry humps his leg before the comic relief host gets his season 2 contract cancelled via sharp blade to the chest. The 3 KKK racialists in white hoods then start bullying budget Elijah Wood until the real Slim Sauron totally shakes off his COVID coma and reveals himself to be a straight-up airbender, until he gets flung around worse than any of the main actors on the CW Supergirl. But I think I already made that joke back in the first vid. The Ku Klux Klanny fannies then suffer the ultimate injustice of getting pelted on the noggin by a bunch of apples, before they get their revenge by going all Antifa and intentionally starting fires in the California forests. Soon enough, they realise he probably ain't Sauron after all, and after totally being gaslit into believing he was a popular Dark Lord and now realising he's just a loser what falls out of the sky and can barely speak English, the giant magic bloke is slipping into a bit of a mid-battle depression. So Nori then inspires this faux Sauron geezer to choose what kind of man he is himself, and so he proceeds to put out the fire while standing up to the baddies, letting us know through showing not telling that he's finally chosen the path of good. But unfortunately, we're dealing with talentless millennial hacks running this show, and in the most stunning piece of writing so far in which subtext is beaten back into plain old text, the giant magic bloke unironically confirms that he's not actually Sauron because he's, and I quote, the good one, before turning the 3 white supremacist hell priests into moths because reasons. And before you can say, wowzers, I can't believe this was a prequel to the Mothman prophecies all along, which was and still is totally underrated as fuck. And also before you can say, that's what you get for making assumptions about his identity, because assumptions make an ass out of you and me, they totally save the day. Huzzah! Meanwhile, Sir Lenny of the Henrys is still clinging on, and says he's about to go wandering off trail. In the darkest euphemism since me mate Dave says he's off to drop the kids off at the pool, which I thought was a discreet code for taking a dump, until I got a visit from the coppers the next morning asking me when I last saw the triplets from next door. Anyway, Lenny then watches an episode of The Rings of Power projected into the sky. Well, I assume that's what he's looking at because he totally seems to fall asleep as his soul leaves his body to finally die. At last, something relatable on this show. Elsewhere, the recently blinded Queen Miriel warns Captain Elendil not to patronise her about doing pretty well at walking up and down a small cabin and counting to 9. Or something like that. Captain Elendil is still a bit butthurt about losing his Aladdin son under a collapsing house in the midst of a giant fuck-off volcanic eruption. Above deck, they arrive back at Numenor after totally failing at saving the Southlands and leaving it a more uninhabitable wasteland than current-day San Francisco. But Elendil seems uneasy, and she asks him what he sees. And before you can say, he sees 60 million big ones spunked up the fucking wall, all the ships fly black flags indicating the king is finally passed, and presumably not that the whole city has been taken over by a bunch of pirates. Then the show recreates my post-Beefy 5 Layers experience on Taco Bell night, when suddenly an explosion comes out of both ends, and apparently the elves can't make a simple ring for love nor money. Halbrand overhears Gladys say maybe they're pushing themselves a bit too hard, and seems to get an idea. whilst I proceed to get triggered with flashbacks, because the last time I pushed myself too hard I totally snapped my banjo string. Anyway! Turns out they've been using too much force, and they simply need a gentler touch. Later, Gladys confronts Halbrand about his true identity after shoving his birth certificate into his face, because she's totally looked him up on www.findoutyourmatespersonalhistory.com and realises that there is no King of the Southlands because the line was broken when the last bloke to bear his crest died 1,000 years ago and was totally hairless. Oh sorry, that was a typo in my script. I meant airless. Anyway, cut a long story short, turns out this ex-Calvin Klein model was totally the one what tramp stamped her brother to death all them years ago. And because she's still not over all that drama, she totally tries to stab him up before he mind rapes her all the way back to frigging childhood. Then he cosplays as her actual brother back when he had that There's Something About Mary hairstyle back in the day. And he tells her to, quote, touch the darkness once more. And before she can go off and fondle Justin Hawkins, we transition back to the high seas where he demands for her to look at him. Presumably because he's watched too much Captain Phillips and he's totally the captain now. Anyway, he wants to make her his bitch. Queen. And reckons she was in the sea in the first place because the elves cast her out, so they ain't really her friends. Though here I thought she ended up adrift in the sea because she totally jumped in like a right stubborn Wally. And all because she didn't want to go home yet. Galadriel seems to drown despite being in her own mind. Before being woken out of her impending dreamy death by the elfy flat-faced fella insisting that it's him, it's totally Elrond, bro. And she asked him to prove it by stating in which year did he invent Scientology. LOL! Up in the tower, Celery Brimbor says she's as wet as an Asian teen at a BTS concert. In River Rock. And instead of telling them all that the most evil Dark Lord whatever Dark Lorded is totally back and masquerading as King of the Southlands, what also models pants on the weekend, she just said he's gone. And if they ever see him again, they ain't ever to bump fists with the geese or ever say Wog-One brother under any circumstances. You see, the blonde female elf with chronic constipation is a bit humiliated about accidentally helping the show's main villain back to power, and so has clearly learned fuck all about just being honest about things. And by the way, I'm still laughing at how this Gilgalad fella sent Gladys home in episode 1 as he finally declared it a time of peace. And barely a few episodes later, Mordor is created, Sauron is back, and the entire Elvish race is more doomed than Boris Johnson in a comb shop. And all this because she jumped off a boat in a moment of rash and hysterical decision making. I guess that's what you get for acting on emotions and not logic. Naturally, Elrond asks her what the friff is going on, but Gladys just tells him to drop it and reminds him of that promise he made earlier about not making the mistake of not trusting her, and he unironically states that she makes promises bloody hard to keep. Which in itself is pretty rich, coming from the same guy who recently just broke a sworn lifetime oath he made to that Scottish dwarf and then totally broke a week or so later when his king recently wanted to know all the gossip and shit. Anyway, she tells her buddies that they now need to make 3 magic ring thingies because in her view, 1 will corrupt, 2 will divide, but 3 will get you a free chicken at Nando's. Bring balance and stuff. And before you can say, well screw it, why not just make 100 of the fuckers and flog them at their local market then? Lord Celery Brimbor says he needs silver and gold from Valinor, and that this madcap scheme can only work if she totally hands over a Valinorian special dagger what belonged to her brother because reasons. Also, these ring thingies are totally all going to be for the elves and the elves alone. Back at the Harfoots camp, the first female Frodo and fake Sauron, what is clearly totally Gandalf because come on bro, are sitting on a hillside and having a long overdue convo now he can totally speak properly again. He clarifies that the word Istar means wizard, and they totally dance around him being that Ian McKellen fella, before Nori reckons she's had about as much adventure as she can handle over the course of these past 8 episodes. And poor Ian doesn't really want to be the one to tell her that Amazon are now planning another 5 seasons of this shit. Bruh. Hilariously, her dad then chucks her bags at her hairy feet and says she should totally sod off with that magic bloke what is clearly dangerous to be around, and who no one really knows given he just randomly fell out of the sky because reasons that are still never explained. And the gender-flipped Samwise Gamgee fella straight up rugby tackles budget Elijah Wood and proceeds to indulge in a longer goodbye scene than the triple never-ending ending in Return of the King. Once they do finally set off though, she hilariously states that her hairy trotters already feel like iron before we realise that she's only walked 10 steps from her camp. Which honestly feels like a parody scene from that bit in Dude Where's My Car, what I'm not allowed to illustrate here because copyright detection. Fuck you, Susan! The giant magic chap is then Gandalf confirmed when he repeats an iconic line from the Peter Jackson movies and tells her that if you ever get a bit lost,
always follow your nose.
In a final symbolic gesture, I guess meaning to convey her letting go of the past, as well as her obsessive vendetta against that spiky head fella what tramp stamped her brother to death decades ago. She smelts her special sword because sacrifice, and they use the fiery juices to forge some poncy jewellery, with just a dash of that fancy new ore muck what the dwarves scraped out of the ground. Meanwhile, Elrond randomly comes upon Halbrand's birth certificate, what they got from www.genealogyforyou.com, and races back up to the tower to confront Gladders over withholding the crucial information about that resurrected Dark Lord who's pretended to be the king of a bunch of humans, and also their close friend who they've totally given free rein to just roam about their kingdom. Unfortunately though, Captain Flatface gets distracted by the 3 rings of power what have finally shown up 7 hours and 58 minutes into an 8-hour show. Huzzah! And we end on the image of Halbrand, aka Proper Sauron, going all emo and walking toward a giant fuck-off volcano in front of dodgy green screen because reasons. And that's it. That's the end to the series. But man, where's the closure though? I mean, what happened to the first black elf with one facial expression and his plain Jane squeeze what also has a Filipino son from Leeds? So many questions. Like, is Aladdin really dead? And did Jeff Bezos really spunk 400 mil into this one season and approve a further 4 more with the same talentless hacks at the helm to lose even more money?
Fact check. That's true.
I mean, there wasn't even an epic showdown with that Bullrock fella what totally woke up at the end of the last epi, leaving me more blue-balled than Muriel's actual blue ball. But I digress. That's the plot and that's your lot. And though we finally come to the end of our journey, there's still plenty more adventures to be had in the realm of recapping and roasting stuff. So consider ringing that bell thing so you don't miss any future recaps. Like Season 2, if I'm still around and can bear to dive back into this shite for another 9 epis that is. Say hello in the comments if you have time, and I'll see you in Mordor. I mean the Southlands. I mean the next one.